The woman sleeping behind Morrison's general store didn't know that morning would change everything, but Xander Cole saw her makeshift home the moment dawn broke over San Andreas, California, and his chest tightened with an anger he couldn't name. He had ridden into town 3 days before, dust from the Nevada territories still clinging to his boots, looking for work that would keep him through the winter of 1884. The gold rush had long since faded from these parts, but San Andreas still thrived as a trading post between the mining camps further east and the settlements closer to the Pacific. Xander had found work at the lumber mill on the edge of town, hard labor that paid decent and asked few questions about a man's past. He had been walking to work before sunrise, cutting through the alley behind the general store to save time, when he spotted the crate. At first, he thought it was just discarded merchandise, another piece of refuse in the narrow space between buildings. Then he saw the blanket, thin and patched, tucked carefully around the edges. A pair of worn boots sat beside the opening, placed neatly as if by someone who still held on to dignity despite circumstance. He had kept walking that first morning, telling himself it wasn't his business, that San Andreas had its share of drifters and down on their luck souls just like every other town in California. The second morning he had seen her. She was emerging from the crate, unfolding herself with careful movements, brushing dust from a faded blue dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish. Her hair was dark, almost black, and she wore it in a long braid that fell past her shoulders. Even from a distance, even in the gray light before dawn, Xander could see she was young, maybe 20 or 21. Too young to be living in a crate, too young to have the kind of weariness in her movements that spoke of months, maybe years of hardship. He had kept walking that second morning too, but his mind stayed in that alley all day. While he worked the lumber, hauling logs, and operating the saw, he thought about that crate. He thought about the way she had brushed at her dress, trying to make herself presentable. He thought about the careful way she had folded her blanket, maintaining order in a space barely big enough for a dog, let alone a human being. This third morning he stopped walking. He stood at the mouth of the alley, watching as she stirred inside the crate. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink and gold, and San Andreas was still quiet except for the occasional rooster and the distant sound of the stamp mill that ran day and night. When she emerged, she startled at seeing him there, her hand flying to her chest. "I'm sorry," Xander said quickly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Didn't mean to frighten you." She studied him warily, one hand gripping the edge of the crate as if ready to retreat back inside. In the growing light, he could see her face more clearly. She had high cheekbones and gray-green eyes that held both fear and defiance. Pretty, he thought, though she looked like she hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Mr. Morrison knows I'm here. He said I could stay as long as I kept the area clean and didn't bother his customers." "Morrison knows?" Xander felt that nameless anger surge again. "He knows you're living in a crate and he's fine with that? It's better than nothing." Her chin lifted slightly. "And it's none of your concern." "That's no home for anyone," Xander said, the words coming out harder than he intended. "A crate behind a store, that's no way to live." "Well, it's what I have." Her eyes flashed. "And like I said, it's not your concern. If you're planning to cause trouble, you can move along. I haven't done anything wrong." Xander ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself for handling this badly. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just think you deserve better than sleeping in a crate is all." "What I deserve and what I have are two different things." She turned away from him, reaching into the crate to pull out a small cloth bag. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get to work." "Where do you work?" She hesitated, clearly debating whether to answer. "The restaurant on Main Street. Mrs. Brennan's place. I help in the kitchen." "How much does she pay you?" Again, not your concern. But something in her expression softened slightly, as if she was surprised by his genuine interest. "Enough to eat once a day and save a little. Eventually, I'll have enough for a room at the boarding house." How long have you been living here? Since July. She shouldered the cloth bag. 4 months. And I've saved almost enough. Another 2 months, maybe three, and I'll have what I need. 4 months living in a crate. Xander felt sick. What's your name? Margot. Margot Owens. I'm Xander Cole. He paused, knowing he needed to get to work, but unwilling to just walk away. Miss Owens, I'd like to help if I can. I don't need charity. Her voice was firm, but he heard the slight waver beneath it, the crack in her armor. Not charity, just one person helping another. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. Let me buy you breakfast at least. A real breakfast, not just scraps from the restaurant kitchen. Margot stared at the coins in his hand. He watched her face, saw the war between pride and hunger playing out in her eyes. Finally, she shook her head. I can't accept your money, but thank you for the offer. She walked past him, heading toward Main Street, and Xander stood there watching her go, this proud, stubborn woman who lived in a crate but wouldn't take help from a stranger. He turned and headed to the lumber mill, but he knew this wasn't over. Couldn't be over. That was no home for anyone, and somehow, some way, he was going to do something about it. The day dragged on forever. Xander worked mechanically, his body going through the familiar motions while his mind stayed fixed on Margot Owens and her crate home. During the midday break, he sat with some of the other mill workers and casually asked about her. The Owens girl? Said a grizzled worker named Pete. She's been around since summer. Came in on the stage, I heard, with nothing but the clothes on her back. Parents died of fever over in the mining camps. Left her with nothing. She's working for Mary Brennan, but Mary can't afford to pay much or provide room and board. The girl's been trying to save up enough for a proper room. And Morrison just lets her live behind his store in a crate? Pete shrugged. Morrison's not as bad as some. He could have run her off entirely. At least he's letting her have some shelter, even if it's not much. There's no charity in this town for folks who can't pay their way. You know how it is. Xander did know how it was. The West was hard, and people survived however they could. But knowing that didn't make it sit any easier in his gut. He had ridden through rough times himself, slept under more stars than roofs, gone hungry more often than he liked to remember. But he was a man, strong and capable of protecting himself. Margot Owens was a young woman alone with no family, vulnerable to every manner of danger. After work, instead of heading back to his room at the boarding house, Xander went to Mrs. Brennan's restaurant. It was a simple establishment, just a dozen tables covered in checkered cloths, but the food was honest and the prices fair. Mary Brennan was a widow in her 50s who had built the business from nothing after her husband died. Mrs. Brennan looked up when he entered, wiping her hands on her apron. Evening, have a seat anywhere. Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about Margot Owens. Her expression became guarded. What about her? I heard she works for you. She does, and she's a good worker, so if you're here to cause trouble for her, you can turn right back around. No trouble, Xander said quickly. I'm trying to help her. I saw where she's living behind Morrison's store. That can't be safe. Mrs. Brennan's face softened. You think I don't know that? You think I like knowing that girl sleeps in a crate? But I can barely keep this place running as it is. I pay her what I can, and I feed her one good meal a day. It's not enough, I know that, but it's all I have to offer. Could you use another customer? Regular, paying customer? Always. Then I'll take my meals here from now on, 3 times a day when I can manage it, and I'd consider it a personal favor if some of that extra income found its way into Miss Owens's pay. Mrs. Brennan studied him with sharp eyes. You got a thing for that girl? Because she's had enough trouble without some cowboy thinking she owes him something. I don't think she owes me anything. I just think she deserves better than a crate. Something in his tone must have convinced her because Mrs. Brennan nodded slowly. All right, then. I can work with that. But you talk to her yourself about this. I won't have her thinking I'm pitying her. Fair enough. Xander ate dinner there that evening, a thick stew and fresh bread that filled his belly better than the fare at the boarding house. He caught glimpses of Margot through the kitchen doorway, her sleeves rolled up as she scrubbed pots and chopped vegetables. She didn't look his way, and he didn't try to get her attention. This would take time, he realized. Trust had to be earned, especially from someone who had learned to rely only on herself. Over the next week, Xander established a routine: breakfast, dinner, and sometimes lunch at Mrs. Brennan's place. He didn't push conversation with Margot, just nodded politely when she occasionally brought out plates or cleared tables. He could feel her watching him, though, curious despite herself. One evening, about a week after their first meeting, she finally approached his table. "Mrs. Brennan says you're the reason I got a raise." Xander looked up from his meal. "She's paying you more? That's good. Don't play ignorant. She told me you're eating here 3 times a day, specifically so she could afford to pay me more." Margot crossed her arms. "Why would you do that?" "Because that crate is no home for anyone." "So you said, but that doesn't explain why it's your problem." Xander set down his fork. "Maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe I should just mind my own business and let you handle your own affairs, but I can't see someone living like that and do nothing." "Call it upbringing. My mother would roll over in her grave if she knew I walked past someone in need every day and didn't lift a finger." Margot's expression softened slightly. "Your mother sounds like she was a good woman." "She was. Died when I was 15. But she taught me enough before then." "I'm sorry." Margot pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, as if making a decision. "Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not your responsibility. I've been taking care of myself for a long time." "How long have you been alone?" "My father died 2 years ago. Fever took him in the camps east of here. My mother died giving birth to me, so it was always just him and me." She looked down at her hands. "He was a miner, always chasing the next strike. We moved around a lot. When he died, the claim went to his partner, and I had nothing. I worked where I could, saved what I could, but it's hard for a woman alone. Finally made it here to San Andreas and found work with Mrs. Brennan." "And you've been in that crate since July." "Since July," she confirmed. "But like I told you, I've almost saved enough for a room. With the extra Mrs. Brennan is paying me now. I'll have it even sooner." "Where will you stay? The boarding house?" "If they'll have me. Mrs. Garrett, who runs it, isn't fond of single women. She thinks we're all potential trouble." Xander knew the type. "There must be other options." "Not many in a town this size, but I'll figure something out. I always do." He studied her across the table, this young woman who had survived losing everything and still managed to hold her head high. She had strength in her, the kind that came from being tested by life and refusing to break. "You said another 2 or 3 months. What if we could make it faster?" I'm good with lumber and I have some tools. What if I built you something better than that crate?" "Nothing fancy, just a small shed with a proper door and roof." "Something weatherproof." Margot shook her head. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I'm offering." "And what would you want in return?" The question stung, though he understood why she asked it. "Nothing. Just the satisfaction of knowing you're sleeping somewhere safe." She searched his face, looking for the lie, the angle, the ulterior motive. He let her look, having nothing to hide. Finally, she said quietly, "I don't understand you." "Nothing to understand. Sometimes people just help because it's the right thing to do. In my experience, people always want something. Then your experience has been with the wrong kind of people." He pushed back from the table. "Think about it. The offer stands either way." He paid for his meal and left, feeling her eyes on his back the whole way out. 2 days later, Xander was working at the mill when someone called his name. He turned to find Margot standing at the edge of the workyard, looking out of place among the sawdust and lumber. He set down his tools and walked over. "If you're serious about building something," she said without preamble, "I'd like to accept your offer, but I'll pay you back every cent it costs for materials." "Deal." He couldn't help but smile. "Though the labor is free. We'll see about that." She almost smiled back. "When can you start?" "I'll need to get materials and talk to Morrison about putting something on his property. Give me a few days to work out the details." "All right." She turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you, Xander." It was the first time she had used his first name, and he liked the sound of it. "You're welcome, Margot." Talking to Morrison proved easier than expected. The store owner was a practical man in his 60s who agreed that a small shed behind his store was acceptable as long as it was neat and didn't interfere with his business. "The girl's been no trouble," Morrison said. "Keeps the area clean, like she promised. If you want to build her something better, I've got no objection." Xander purchased lumber from the mill at a discount, using his employee rate. He bought nails, hinges for a door, and some tar paper for the roof. The shed would be small, just large enough for a bed and maybe a small table, but it would be sturdy and weatherproof. More importantly, it would have a door that locked from the inside. He started work the following Sunday, his one day off from the mill. Margot came to watch, and to his surprise, she rolled up her sleeves and helped. She had no experience with carpentry, but she was a quick learner and wasn't afraid of hard work. Together, they measured and cut, hammered, and fitted. Other townspeople passed by the alley throughout the day, some curious, some approving, a few muttering about impropriety. "Let them talk," Margot said when she noticed him glancing at the disapproving faces. "They've been talking about me since I got here anyway. Doesn't it bother you? I've learned that talk is just noise. What matters is surviving, keeping your dignity, and moving forward." They worked through the day, stopping only when the light grew too dim to see properly. The frame was up, and the roof would go on next Sunday. Xander's hands were sore, and he knew he would feel this in his shoulders tomorrow, but it was a good kind of tired. "I could make us dinner," Margot offered as they cleaned up the tools. "Not much, but I have some things in my bag." "I'd like that." She retrieved her cloth bag from the crate and pulled out a small pot, some dried beans, and a precious bit of salt pork. There was a fire ring in the alley, probably used by Morrison for burning trash, and she built up a small fire with expert efficiency. As she cooked, they talked. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Texas, little town called Cedar Springs, south of Dallas. My family had a ranch, nothing big, but it was home. What brought you out here?" Xander was quiet for a moment. "My father died when I was 17. Accident with a horse. After my mother had already passed, that left just me and my younger sister. I tried to keep the ranch going, but I was young and didn't know enough. We lost it to debt within 2 years. My sister went to live with our aunt in Houston. I've been moving around ever since, taking work where I can find it." "Do you still talk to your sister?" "When I can. I send letters when I settle somewhere long enough. Last I heard, she was getting married to a clerk in Houston. Good man, apparently. You miss her?" "Every day." He watched the firelight play across Margot's face. "What about you? Any siblings?" "No, just me. I used to wish for brothers or sisters, especially after my father would be gone for days working the claims. It was lonely, being by myself so much." "Is that why you came to San Andreas? To be less lonely?" "I came here because the stage ran here and I could afford the ticket. But yes, I suppose I hoped for community, for a place to belong. Haven't quite found that yet, but I'm still working on it." The beans were simple but filling, seasoned with the salt pork and cooked over the open fire. They ate sitting on crates that Morrison had said they could use, the fire warming them as the autumn night grew cool around them. "This is nice," Margot said softly. "I haven't had company for a meal in a long time." "Neither have I. I mean, I eat with the mill workers sometimes. But that's different." "Different how?" This feels more real, I guess. Less like just filling the time between work and sleep. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers. When Xander finally stood to leave, Margot stood too. "Thank you for today," she said. "For all of this. Same time next Sunday? I'll be here." He walked back to the boarding house with a lightness in his chest that had been absent for months, maybe years. There was something about Margot Owens that got under his skin in the best possible way. Her strength, her pride, her refusal to be defeated by circumstances that would have broken most people. He wanted to know more about her, wanted to spend more time in her company, wanted to be the person who gave her back some of the comfort and security that life had stolen from her. The next Sunday, they finished the roof and hung the door. The shed was small but solid, with enough room for a narrow bed, a small table, and space to store belongings. Margot stood back and looked at it with shining eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. "I can't believe I have a real door, a door with a lock." "A woman should feel safe where she sleeps," Xander said. He handed her the key. "It's not much, but it's yours." She took the key, clutching it tightly. "It's everything." They moved her meager belongings from the crate to the shed. It didn't take long. She had so little: the thin blanket, a change of clothes, a few personal items. Xander made a note to himself to see about getting her a proper mattress, maybe some extra blankets for winter. "I need to pay you back," Margot said, "for the materials. In time, there's no rush. I don't like being in debt. Then pay me back in company. Have dinner with me sometimes. Talk with me. That's payment enough." She studied him with those gray-green eyes. "You really don't want anything else?" "I really don't. Most men would. I'm not most men." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised him. She stepped forward and hugged him, quick but genuine. "Thank you, Xander, truly." His arms came up instinctively, returning the embrace before she pulled away. "You're welcome, Margot. Truly." Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Xander took his meals at Mrs. Brennan's restaurant, and Margot would sit with him when the evening rush died down. They talked about everything and nothing: their pasts, their hopes, books they had read, places they wanted to see. Xander learned that Margot loved poetry and could recite Longfellow from memory. Margot learned that Xander had a gift for storytelling and could spin tales about his wandering years that made her laugh until tears ran down her face. He was falling for her. He knew it and didn't fight it. Somewhere between building the shed and their nightly conversations, Margot had become more than just someone he was helping. She had become the first person he thought about when he woke up and the last person he thought about before sleep. He found himself working faster at the mill so he could get to the restaurant sooner. He found himself buying little things he thought she might need or like: a book of poems he found at the general store, a warmer blanket, a pair of gloves for winter. She accepted the gifts with growing ease, no longer fighting so hard to maintain her independence. She was letting him in, letting down her walls, and he treasured each small surrender. One evening in late October, they were sitting by the fire behind the shed when Margot said, "I've saved enough for a room at the boarding house." Xander's heart sank. "That's good. That's what you wanted." "It is." She poked at the fire with a stick. "But I'm not sure I want to leave." "The shed?" "The shed, this spot, you." She looked up at him. "I've gotten used to having you around. I'll still be around. I'll still eat at the restaurant. It won't be the same. Mrs. Garrett has strict rules about male visitors, and the boarding house is on the other side of town." Xander chose his words carefully. "You could stay here, in the shed. It's yours, and Morrison doesn't mind. People are already talking about us, about how much time we spend together. Let them talk. It's different for women, you know that. If my reputation gets too damaged, Mrs. Brennan might let me go. She can't afford to have her business associated with scandal." Xander took a breath. He had been thinking about this for weeks, weighing options, considering futures. There's another solution. What's that? You could marry me. The words hung in the air between them. Margot stared at him, the firelight reflecting in her wide eyes. Marry you? She repeated. I know it's sudden. I know we haven't known each other long. But Margot, I care about you. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. I think about you constantly. I want to be the person who makes sure you never have to sleep in a crate again, who makes sure you always have enough to eat, who keeps you safe and warm and happy. I want to build a life with you. Xander. Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm not rich. I don't have much to offer except hard work and loyalty and whatever love I'm capable of giving. But I'd give it all to you, gladly, if you'd have me. She was quiet for so long, he thought she might refuse. Then she said, I care about you too. I have for weeks now. I kept trying not to because I was afraid. Afraid of depending on someone, afraid of losing someone again, afraid of wanting something too much and having it taken away. I can't promise life won't be hard sometimes, but I can promise I won't leave unless you send me away. I don't want to send you away. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. Yes, I'll marry you. Relief and joy flooded through him. He pulled her close, holding her carefully, as if she might disappear if he held too tight. I'll make you happy, Margot. I swear I will. You already do. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in San Andreas. Mrs. Brennan stood as witness, along with Pete from the lumber mill. Margot wore a new dress that Xander had purchased from the dressmaker in town, simple but pretty, the color of cream with blue trim. She carried wildflowers that she had picked that morning. Standing at the altar, watching her walk toward him, Xander felt his throat tighten with emotion. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was his. His to protect, his to cherish, his to build a future with. When the minister asked if he would take this woman to be his lawfully wedded wife, his I do rang out clear and certain. Margot's voice was softer when she spoke her vows, but no less sure. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xander kissed her gently, sealing the promise they had made to each other. They had a small celebration at Mrs. Brennan's restaurant, the proprietor having insisted on providing a wedding meal. Other townspeople came by to offer congratulations, and Xander was surprised and touched by how many people had come to care about Margot during her months in San Andreas. She had been so alone when he first saw her, but she had made connections, built relationships, become part of the community in ways she probably hadn't even realized. The boarding house was no longer an option for a married couple, but Xander had a solution. He had been saving his wages carefully, and combined with what Margot had managed to put away, they had enough to rent a small house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just 3 rooms and a patch of dirt for a garden, but it was theirs. On their wedding night, Xander carried Margot across the threshold of their new home, making her laugh with the traditional gesture. He set her down gently in the main room, which held a table, 2 chairs, and a stove. It's not fancy, he said, suddenly nervous. It's perfect. She turned to face him. It's ours. That makes it perfect. They stood there for a moment, husband and wife, suddenly aware of the intimacy of being alone together in their own space. Xander reached up and gently removed the pins from her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. I meant what I said in my vows, he told her. I will love you and protect you for as long as I live. I know. She reached up to touch his face. And I will stand by you, whatever comes. We're in this together now. He kissed her then, deeper than the chaste kiss at the altar, and she responded with equal passion. They made their way to the bedroom, learning each other with tenderness and growing confidence, 2 people who had been alone for so long finally finding home in each other's arms. In the weeks and months that followed, they built their life together, piece by piece. Margot continued working at the restaurant, though Mrs. Brennan gave her more responsibility and better pay. Xander kept his job at the mill and picked up extra work when he could find it. Together, they saved money, slowly furnishing their house with the things they needed. Winter came to San Andreas, mild by most standards, but still cold enough to make them grateful for their warm home and each other. They spent evenings by the stove, Margot reading aloud from her poetry books, while Xander worked on small carpentry projects. Sometimes they just talked, sharing dreams and making plans. "I'd like to have children someday," Margot said one evening. "A family of our own." "I'd like that too." Xander pulled her closer on the small sofa they had purchased. "How many?" "3 or 4. I hated being an only child. I want our children to have siblings, to never feel alone like I did." "3 or 4 sounds perfect." She smiled against his shoulder. "What else do you want?" "For our future, I mean." "I want to buy us a real house someday, not just rent. Maybe with some land where we could keep horses. I miss working with horses." "That sounds wonderful. Where would we do this?" "We could stay here in San Andreas, or we could move somewhere else if you wanted. I'm not attached to any particular place anymore. Home is wherever you are." She turned her face up to kiss him. "You say the most romantic things sometimes." "Only when I'm inspired." Spring brought new opportunities. The mill owner, impressed with Xander's work and reliability, offered him a foreman position with a significant increase in wages. It meant longer hours and more responsibility, but it also meant they could start saving in earnest for the house and land they wanted. One warm evening in April, Margot met Xander at the mill gate with news written all over her face. "What is it?" he asked, immediately concerned. "I'm pregnant." She said it quietly, watching for his reaction. For a moment, Xander couldn't speak. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing wider and wider until he let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around. "Careful," she laughed. "Put me down." He set her down gently, his hands going immediately to her still, flat stomach. "A baby? We're going to have a baby." "We are." Her eyes were shining with happy tears. "Are you happy?" "Happy? Margot, I'm happier than I knew how to be." "When?" "The doctor thinks late October or early November. We need to prepare. We need to get a cradle and more blankets, and the house needs another room. I can build one on the back, extend the bedroom." She laughed at his sudden rush of plans. "We have time, months and months to get ready." But Xander was already planning, already thinking about how to make their small house bigger, how to provide for his growing family. That night, he lay in bed with his hand on Margot's stomach, imagining the life growing inside her, the child that would be part him and part her, a physical manifestation of their love. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Margot continued working through the summer, though Mrs. Brennan insisted she take on lighter duties as she grew bigger. Xander worked on expanding their house, adding a nursery with windows that caught the morning light. Other mill workers helped in their spare time, and the project that Xander thought might take months was completed in just 6 weeks. Margot nested, making curtains for the nursery and sewing tiny clothes. She talked to the baby constantly, telling it about its father, about the life they were building, about how loved it already was. In late October, just over a year after Xander had first seen Margot emerging from that crate behind the general store, she went into labor. Mrs. Brennan came to help, along with the doctor's wife, who served as the town's midwife. Xander paced in the main room, listening to Margot's cries, feeling helpless and terrified. "First babies take time," Mrs. Brennan told him kindly. "She's strong. She'll be fine." Xander wasn't so sure. He had heard too many stories of women dying in childbirth, of babies born too early or too weak. He prayed harder than he had in years, making bargains with God he knew he might not be able to keep. But Margot was strong as he had always known. After hours of labor, as the October sun was setting, a baby's cry filled the house. Xander's head jerked up, hope and fear warring in his chest. Mrs. Brennan emerged from the bedroom, smiling. "You have a son, healthy and loud." Xander didn't wait to hear more. He rushed into the bedroom where Margot lay exhausted but smiling, a tiny bundle in her arms. He approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at his son. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair, and his eyes squeezed shut as he wailed. He was perfect. "Do you want to hold him?" Margot asked. Xander sat carefully on the edge of the bed and let her transfer the baby into his arms. The weight was so slight, the body so small, and yet Xander felt as if his heart might burst from the love that surged through him. This was his son, his and Margot's, a part of both of them, a new life they had created together. "Hello," he whispered to the baby. "Hello, little one. I'm your father." The baby's cries quieted at the sound of his voice, and Xander looked up at Margot with wonder in his eyes. She was watching them both with such love on her face that he had to blink back tears. "We need to name him," she said softly. "What do you think of Thomas?" "After my father?" "Thomas Cole, I like it." She reached out to stroke the baby's head. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to your family." The first months with Thomas were exhausting, but joyful. He was a good baby, sleeping in decent stretches and eating well. Margot recovered quickly from the birth, and within weeks she was back to managing the household, though she had left her job at the restaurant to focus on being a mother. Xander threw himself into providing for his family. He took on extra projects at the mill and began doing carpentry work on the side. The extra income went into savings, building toward the dream of their own land. Thomas grew quickly, hitting each milestone right on schedule. He was a happy baby who smiled easily and laughed at his father's silly faces. Watching Margot with their son, seeing the gentle way she cared for him, the patience she showed, made Xander fall even more deeply in love with his wife. When Thomas was 6 months old, an opportunity presented itself. A farmer on the outskirts of San Andreas was selling off portions of his land, parcels of 5 to 10 acres, at reasonable prices. Xander and Margot went to look at the property on a Sunday afternoon, bringing Thomas along. The land was beautiful, rolling hills with good soil and a creek running through one corner. There was a spot near the creek that would be perfect for a house, sheltered by oak trees but with a clear view across the valley. "What do you think?" Xander asked Margot as they stood on the highest point of the 10-acre parcel. "I think it's perfect." She shifted Thomas on her hip. "Can we afford it?" "Barely. It would take everything we've saved. But yes, we could do it." "Then let's do it. Let's build our home here." They bought the land that same week, signing the papers at the bank with hands that shook slightly with the magnitude of what they were doing. This was permanent. This was putting down roots. This was claiming their piece of California and declaring that they belonged here. Building the house took time. They couldn't afford to hire it done, so Xander did most of the work himself with help from friends at the mill on weekends. Margot helped when she could, bringing water and tools, while Thomas played in the shade. The house grew slowly but steadily through that summer and into fall. Walls, roof, windows, doors. By the time Thomas was 18 months old, the house was finished enough to move into. It was larger than their rental in town, with 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a front porch that looked out across the valley. Margot cried when she saw it complete, overcome with emotion at having a real home, a place that was truly theirs. "Remember that crate?" Xander said, holding her on the porch while Thomas toddled around their feet. "Behind Morrison's store? I remember." She leaned against him. "I remember thinking I would never have anything better, that I would spend my whole life scraping by, just barely surviving. And now? Now I have everything I ever dreamed of, and more than I thought possible." She turned to face him. "You gave me this, Xander. You saw me when I was invisible. You cared when no one else did. You loved me when I had nothing to offer but myself. You gave me just as much. You gave me purpose and family and love. You gave me a reason to stop drifting and start building something real." They kissed while Thomas tugged on their legs, wanting attention, and they both laughed, breaking apart to scoop up their son. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Xander left the mill to work their land full time, planning to eventually raise horses as he had dreamed. They started with a vegetable garden and some chickens, building up slowly and carefully. Margot transformed their house into a home with curtains she sewed herself and furniture that Xander built during the winter months when outdoor work was limited. When Thomas was 2, Margot became pregnant again. This time she carried the baby with the confidence of experience, and when their second son was born in the spring of 1888, the labor was shorter and easier. They named him Robert after Margot's father. 2 sons, 2 healthy, happy boys. Xander would come in from the fields and find them playing together, Thomas being surprisingly gentle with his baby brother, and feel such gratitude it was almost painful. He had been given so much more than he deserved. The years rolled on in that way years do when life is good. Thomas and Robert grew into strong boys who helped around the property and filled the house with noise and laughter. Xander built up a small herd of horses, buying and breeding carefully, establishing a reputation for quality stock. Margot kept the house and garden, and when the boys started school, she volunteered to help teach the younger children, having discovered a love of education. In 1891, their third child arrived, a daughter they named Lily. She looked just like Margot, with the same gray-green eyes and dark hair. Xander was completely smitten from the first moment, and Thomas and Robert treated their baby sister like she was made of glass, being so careful and protective that Margot had to remind them Lily wouldn't break if they touched her. More years passed. The boys grew tall and capable. Lily grew into a bright, curious child who followed her brothers everywhere and learned to ride almost before she could walk properly. Xander and Margot grew older together, lines appearing at the corners of their eyes, their hair showing threads of gray. In 1895, when Thomas was 10, Robert was 7, and Lily was 4, Margot became pregnant one final time. She was 32 now, and this pregnancy was harder than the others. Xander worried constantly, but Margot assured him she was fine, just older and more tired than she had been with the previous babies. Their fourth child, another boy they named James, was born in early 1896. He was smaller than his siblings had been, but healthy and strong-lunged. With 4 children, the house was constantly full of activity and noise, and Xander couldn't imagine life any other way. One evening in 1898, after all the children were finally in bed, Xander and Margot sat together on the front porch as they had done countless times before. The ranch had prospered beyond their early dreams. They had 30 horses now, and Xander's reputation as a horseman extended throughout the county. They had expanded the house twice more and owned 20 acres instead of 10. "Do you remember the first time we sat together?" Margot asked. "By the fire in the alley behind Morrison's store. I remember. You made beans with salt pork, and it was the best meal I had eaten in months. It was terrible beans. It was perfect because I was eating them with you." He reached over and took her hand. "That was the night I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were going to change my life. That I was never going to be the same after meeting you. You changed my life too. You saved me, Xander. Not just from the crate, but from hopelessness. From believing I didn't deserve anything better. You always deserved better. You just needed someone to help you see it." She rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out over their valley. From inside the house came a cry, probably James having a nightmare. Margot started to rise, but Xander stopped her. "I'll get him. You rest." He went inside and found James sitting up in the bed he shared with Robert, tears on his face. Xander picked up his youngest son and held him close. "Shh, it's all right. Papa's here." James snuggled into his father's chest, his tears slowing. "Bad dream. Dreams can't hurt you. You're safe." He carried James back to bed, tucking him in beside Robert, who slept through the entire thing. In the next room, he checked on Lily, who was sprawled across her bed in the boneless way of sleeping children. In the room beyond, Thomas was reading by lamplight, though he was supposed to be asleep. "Put the light out," Xander said quietly. It's late. Just finishing this chapter. Now, Thomas, his eldest son grinned and complied, settling down into his blankets. Good night, Papa. Good night, son. Xander returned to the porch where Margot still sat and settled back beside her. Everyone all right? She asked. Everyone's fine. James had a nightmare. Thomas was reading instead of sleeping. That boy is going to read us into bankruptcy with how many books he goes through. There are worse problems to have. They sat together until the night grew too cold, then went inside to their own bed. In the darkness, Margot curled against Xander's side, and he wrapped his arms around her. I love you, she whispered. Even more now than the day we married. I love you too. Always have, always will. They fell asleep that way, holding each other, secure in the life they had built, and the love that had started with a simple observation. That crate behind the general store was no home for anyone. Years continued to roll past like the seasons in California, each one bringing changes both small and momentous. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who loved books as much as horses. At 16, he announced his intention to become a teacher, wanting to bring education to the rural communities that often went without. Xander and Margot supported his dream, proud of their eldest son's compassion and intelligence. Robert was different from his brother, more interested in the physical work of the ranch. He had a natural gift with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animal with patience and intuition. At 14, he was already invaluable to Xander in the daily operations of the ranch. Lily at 11 was growing into a young woman who had inherited her mother's strength and her father's storytelling ability. She could often be found writing in journals, creating tales of adventure and romance that she would sometimes share at the dinner table, making everyone laugh. James, the youngest at 8, was still finding his way, but he showed signs of having inherited the best traits from all his family members. Thomas's love of learning, Robert's patience with animals, Lily's creativity, and both parents' determination. The ranch continued to prosper. Xander had achieved his dream of being known throughout California as a breeder of quality horses. People came from as far as Sacramento and San Francisco to purchase Cole horses, knowing they were getting animals that were sound in body and temperament. The income allowed them to expand further, hire help during busy seasons, and ensure their children would have opportunities for education and advancement. Margot had found her calling in education, teaching not just at the schoolhouse but offering evening classes for adults who had never learned to read or write. She remembered too well what it was like to have limited opportunities, and she was determined to help others improve their circumstances through literacy and learning. In 1902, on a warm October evening, Xander and Margot celebrated 20 years of marriage. Their children threw them a party, inviting friends from town and neighbors from surrounding ranches. Mrs. Brennan, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, made the cake herself and regaled everyone with stories of the early days when Margot had worked in her kitchen. I knew the moment I saw how that young man looked at her, Mrs. Brennan said, gesturing at Xander with her cane, that it was only a matter of time before they figured out what everyone else could already see. And what was that? Lily asked, delighted by the story. That they were meant for each other, child. Some people just fit together like pieces of a puzzle, and these two were like that from the start. Later, when the party had wound down and the children were cleaning up, Xander and Margot slipped away to the front porch, their favorite place to steal moments alone. 20 years, Margot marveled. It feels like both forever and no time at all. Any regrets? Not a single one. You? Only that I didn't see you sooner. That you had to spend even one night in that crate before I found you. She leaned against him. Everything happened exactly as it was supposed to. I wouldn't change anything because it brought us here, to this moment, with these children and this life. The door opened and James came out. Mama, Robert is making Lily wash all the dishes by herself. Margot sighed good-naturedly. I should go referee. I'll come with you. Xander stood and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet. No rest for parents. No rest, but plenty of joy, Margot agreed. They went inside together, as they had done for 20 years, partners in all things, facing each challenge and celebration side by side. The seasons cycled on. Thomas left for teacher training in Sacramento when he turned 18, writing long letters home about his studies and the new ideas he was learning. Robert took on more responsibility at the ranch, proving himself capable of handling the business side as well as the animal husbandry. Lily, at 13, was beginning to attract the attention of local boys, much to her father's consternation and her mother's amusement. "She's too young," Xander grumbled one evening, after turning away yet another stammering young man who had come calling. "She's the same age I was when I went to work for Mrs. Brennan," Margot pointed out, "and only a few years younger than I was when we married." "That's different." "How is it different?" "Because she's my daughter." Margot laughed and patted his arm. "She has a good head on her shoulders. We raised her right. Trust that." And Xander did trust it, though it didn't make it easier to watch his little girl grow up. But he took comfort in knowing that Lily had seen what a good marriage looked like, had grown up watching her parents treat each other with respect and love. She would know what to look for in a partner because she had seen it modeled every day of her life. In 1905, Thomas returned to San Andreas, having completed his training. He took a position at the school where his mother had once volunteered, teaching the older children. He boarded at the old boarding house in town, the same one Margot had once saved toward, and he came home to the ranch every Sunday for dinner. That same year, Robert announced he was courting a girl named Sarah Winters, whose family owned a ranch to the north. She was a sweet girl with a practical nature and a genuine love of ranch life. Xander and Margot welcomed her warmly, seeing how happy she made their son. "Do you remember when I asked you to marry me?" Xander asked Margot one night after Robert and Sarah had left following dinner. "Of course, by the fire behind the shed you built me. You were so nervous. I was terrified you would say no. I was terrified you weren't serious." She smiled at the memory. "We've come so far from those frightened young people." "Do you think Robert is as sure about Sarah as I was about you?" "I think he is. He has that same look you had, like she's the most important thing in his world." Robert and Sarah were married the following spring in a ceremony at the church in San Andreas, the same church where Xander and Margot had wed more than 20 years earlier. It was a full circle moment that left Margot in tears and Xander struggling to maintain his composure. After the wedding, Robert brought Sarah to live at the ranch in a small house that Xander helped him build on the northern edge of their property. It was practical and symbolic, Robert establishing his own household while staying close to the family business. Lily, now 15, had settled on a young man named David Stone, the son of the town's blacksmith. He was respectful and hardworking, and Xander grudgingly admitted he was suitable, though he still thought 15 was too young for serious courtship. "She has time," Margot reminded him. "Let her be young." James, at 13, was showing an interest in engineering and mechanics. He spent hours taking things apart and putting them back together, figuring out how they worked. Xander didn't fully understand this interest, coming from a world of horses and land, but he supported it, getting James books on the subject and encouraging his curiosity. In 1907, the ranch faced its first serious challenge in years. A drought struck California, lasting through the summer and into fall. The creek that had always run reliably began to dry up, and the grazing land turned brown and brittle. Xander was forced to buy feed from other sources, depleting their savings. Some of the horses had to be sold earlier than planned, at lower prices than normal. It was a stressful time, but the family pulled together. Robert and Sarah postponed their plans to expand their house. Thomas contributed part of his teacher's salary to help with expenses. Even Lily and James pitched in, taking on extra chores to reduce the need for hired help. "We'll get through this," Margot said firmly, during a particularly difficult evening when Xander was going over the accounts, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. "We've survived worse." "Have we? This could break us, Margot." If the drought continues, if we have to keep buying feed, selling horses at a loss. Do you remember when I lived in a crate? When I didn't know where my next meal would come from? When I thought I would spend my whole life just barely surviving? She put her hands on his shoulders. We've built something strong here, strong enough to weather a drought, strong enough to weather anything. Her confidence bolstered him. They tightened their belts, made difficult decisions, and kept working. And Margot was right. When the rains finally came that winter, the ranch survived. They had lost some ground financially, but they hadn't lost the land or the core breeding stock. They could rebuild. The years immediately following the drought were good ones. The ranch recovered and then exceeded its previous productivity. Robert and Sarah had their first child, a son named William, making Xander and Margot grandparents for the first time. Holding his grandson, Xander was overwhelmed with emotion, thinking about the continuation of family, the legacy that would outlive him. Thomas met a young woman named Elizabeth from Sacramento, another teacher. They courted through letters and occasional visits, and married in 1909. They made their home in town, where they both taught and became pillars of the community. Lily married David Stone in 1910, becoming the blacksmith's wife, but maintaining her love of writing. She began submitting stories to magazines, and to everyone's delight, some of them were accepted for publication. She continued living in San Andreas, close enough to visit the ranch regularly. James, at 18, announced his intention to attend university to study engineering. It would mean leaving California for the East Coast, but Xander and Margot encouraged him to pursue his dreams, just as they had supported all their children's ambitions. By 1912, Xander was 50 years old and Margot was 49. They had 5 grandchildren with more on the way. The ranch was more successful than Xander had ever imagined back in those early days. But more than the success, more than the prosperity, was the knowledge that they had built something lasting. They had created a family, established a legacy, proved that 2 people with nothing but love and determination could build a life worth living. One evening that summer, they sat on the porch as the sun set over their valley. It was a familiar ritual, one they had practiced for so many years it was ingrained in their routine. "Do you ever think about that first morning?" Margot asked. "When you saw me coming out of the crate?" "Sometimes. I remember thinking you deserved better. I remember being afraid of you, afraid you wanted something from me I couldn't give. And instead you gave me everything. A home, a family, a life I couldn't have imagined. You took a woman living in a crate and made her into this." She gestured at the ranch, at the life they had built. "How did we get so lucky?" "I don't think it was luck. I think it was choice. We chose each other. We chose to work hard. We chose to face challenges together. We chose love every single day." She turned to look at him, this man who had changed her life so completely. His hair was more gray than brown now, and lines creased his face, but he was still the same person who had stood in that alley and declared that a crate was no home for anyone. Still the same person who had built her a shed, asked her to marry him, built a ranch with his own hands, raised 4 children to be good people. "I would choose you again," she said softly. "1,000 times over in every lifetime, I would choose you." He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "And I would choose you. Always." The years continued to pass, bringing more changes, more grandchildren, more joys, and occasional sorrows. But through it all, Xander and Margot remained constant, their love the foundation upon which everything else was built. In 1920, they celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary. All 4 children came home with their families, filling the ranch house with noise and laughter and love. There were 11 grandchildren now, ranging from William at 13 to baby Clara, Robert and Sarah's youngest, at just 3 months. Xander, now 58, moved a bit slower but was still active on the ranch. Margot, at 57, had retired from teaching but remained busy with her grandchildren and her garden. They had handed over day-to-day operations of the ranch to Robert years ago, though Xander still consulted on major decisions and enjoyed working with the horses. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, filling every available space in the house and spilling over into Robert and Sarah's place, Xander and Margot once again found themselves on the porch. Quite a legacy we've built, Xander observed, thinking of all those children and grandchildren sleeping under their roof and nearby. Quite a legacy you started, Margot corrected, when you decided a crate was no home for anyone. We built it together. We did. She took his hand. But it started with your compassion, your willingness to see someone who felt invisible, your belief that I deserved better. You did deserve better. You deserved everything, and you gave it to me. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands as the stars wheeled overhead. From inside the house came the sound of a baby crying, quickly soothed. The sound of family, of life continuing, of love multiplying. Do you remember what you said to me that first morning? Margot asked, after you saw the crate. I said that was no home for anyone. You were right. It wasn't a home. It was just shelter, just survival. But this. She squeezed his hand. This is a home. What we've built together, the family we've raised, the love we've shared. This is what home really is. I couldn't have built it without you. And I couldn't have built it without you. We did it together, every step of the way. Xander thought about the journey they had taken from that morning in the alley to this moment on the porch. It had been 38 years, and yet it felt both longer and shorter than that. Longer because they had packed so much living into those years. Shorter because time moved so fast when you were happy, when you were with the person you loved. What do you want for the next 38 years? He asked, only half joking. This. Exactly this. More time with you, watching our grandchildren grow, maybe meeting some great-grandchildren, working in my garden, sitting on this porch, growing old with you. That sounds perfect to me. And it was perfect. Not in the sense of being without challenges or difficulties, but perfect in the way that mattered. Perfect because it was theirs, built with their own hands and hearts, created from nothing but determination and love. More years passed, as years do. Xander and Margot grew older, their hair turning completely white, their movements slower, but still sure. They watched their grandchildren grow up and start families of their own. Thomas's eldest daughter became a doctor. Robert's son William took over the ranch. Lily's writing career flourished, her books selling throughout the country. James became a successful engineer, working on major construction projects, though he always came home for Christmas. In 1925, on a cold November evening, Xander fell ill. It started as a simple cough, but quickly worsened. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and did what he could, but medicine could only do so much for a man of 63 who had lived a hard life. Margot barely left his side during those weeks. She held his hand, read to him, reminded him of all the good times they had shared. The children came, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren to say goodbye. The ranch house was full again, but this time the mood was somber rather than celebratory. On a quiet morning in December, with snow falling softly outside, Xander opened his eyes and found Margot sitting beside the bed, holding his hand, as she had for 43 years. You're still here, he said, his voice weak. Where else would I be? You should rest. I'll rest later. Right now, I'm where I belong. He managed a small smile. Do you remember when I built you that shed? I remember everything. Best thing I ever did, stopping in that alley. Best thing I ever did was saying yes when you asked me to marry you. No regrets? Not a single one. You gave me a beautiful life, Xander Cole. You loved me when I had nothing. You built a home for me, a family, a future. You were everything I needed and more than I deserved. You deserved everything. He squeezed her hand weakly. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll be happy, that you'll keep living, keep loving our family. Don't stop because I'm gone. Tears streamed down Margot's face. I promise, but I'm not ready to let you go. I know. I'm not ready either. But Margot, what a journey we've had. What a life we've built. I'm so grateful for every moment. So am I. They sat together in silence, hands clasped. And while the snow fell outside and the house full of family waited quietly in the other rooms. As the morning light grew stronger, Xander's breathing became more labored, and then, with Margot holding his hand and whispering that she loved him, he slipped away peacefully. Margot sat for a long moment, still holding his hand, tears falling silently. The man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had loved her when she felt unlovable, who had built her first a shed and then a life, was gone. The pain was immense, but so was the gratitude. They had been given 43 years together, years filled with love and partnership and joy. Not everyone was so lucky. She stood finally, leaning down to kiss his forehead one last time. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for seeing me, for loving me, for giving me the most beautiful life I could have imagined. The funeral was held on a cold December day, but it seemed like half the county came to pay respects. Xander Cole had been known as an honest man, a good horseman, a devoted husband and father. The church was packed with people whose lives he had touched in some way. At the cemetery, Margot stood surrounded by her 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. As they lowered Xander's casket into the ground, she thought about the legacy they had built together. It wasn't just the ranch or the horses or the material success. It was this: 4 children who had grown into good people, who had raised their own children with love and values, who were continuing the tradition of family and compassion that she and Xander had started. In the months following Xander's death, Margot grieved, but she also remembered her promise. She continued living, continued being active in her family's lives. She moved into a smaller cottage on the ranch property, leaving the main house to Robert and Sarah and their growing family. She spent her days in her garden with her grandchildren, writing letters to her far-flung family members. On warm evenings, she would sit on her small porch and remember. She would think about that first morning when Xander had seen her emerging from the crate. She would remember his words. "That's no home for anyone." She would remember the shed he built, the proposal by firelight, the wedding, the birth of their children, the building of the ranch, the countless evenings spent together on the porch. Most of all, she would remember the love, the steady, constant, enduring love that had carried them through 43 years of marriage, through challenges and triumphs, through the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones. It was a love that had started with a simple act of compassion and had grown into something that would echo through generations. Margot lived for another 12 years, surrounded by family, watching her great-grandchildren grow, tending her garden, and keeping Xander's memory alive through the stories she told. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1937 at the age of 74 and was buried beside Xander in the San Andreas cemetery. At her funeral, her children spoke about their parents' love story. They told about the crate behind Morrison's general store, about the shed their father had built, about the ranch that had started with nothing but determination and love. They spoke about the example their parents had set, the values they had instilled, the legacy they had created. Thomas, now 52 and the town's most respected educator, said it best. "Our father saw our mother when she was invisible. He loved her when she had nothing. He built her first a shed, then a home, then a life. But more importantly, he taught us all what real love looks like. It looks like compassion. It looks like partnership. It looks like choosing each other every single day, through easy times and hard times, through joy and sorrow. That's the legacy they've left us. Not just this ranch, not just this family, but the knowledge of what it means to truly love someone." The ranch continued under Robert's management, and eventually passed to his son William. The Cole family remained in San Andreas for generations, always remembering the story of how it all started. The shed behind Morrison's general store was long gone, torn down decades earlier, but the house that Xander built stood strong, home to generation after generation of his descendants. And on the porch of that house, as the sun set over the California Valley, you could sometimes find members of the Cole family sitting together, holding hands, watching the stars come out. They were continuing a tradition started more than 100 years before by two people who had found each other when they each needed someone most. The love story of Xander and Margot became legend in San Andreas, passed down through generations as an example of what was possible when compassion met determination, when love was chosen daily, when two people decided that everyone deserved a home and then spent their lives building one together. It was a story that started with a simple observation about a crate and ended with a legacy that would last forever. It was proof that the smallest act of kindness could change not just one life, but generations of lives to come. And so the story ended where all good love stories should end, with a love that never truly died, that lived on in the hearts and lives of those who came after, that proved beyond any doubt that when one person sees another and says, "You deserve better," then commits to making that better a reality, miracles can happen. Home was never just a place. It was the feeling you got when someone looked at you and decided you mattered. It was what Xander gave Margot that first morning in the alley, and what they gave each other every day after until their last breath. Home was love, and their home was the strongest ever built.